Chapter 24, Environmental Policy, Law, and Planning. Policy is a course of action taken or adopted by a government or other agency to address some issue. How are policies made? What policies drive environmental enforcement in the U.S.? This chapter addresses these questions as well as other issues related to environmental policy. If policy is a course of action taken, then the environmental policy are the rules and regulations about the environment. These rules are shaped by the public opinion and are based on three main principles: the needs of humans, the health of ecosystems, and sustainability. The precautionary principle. One such policy adopted by many nations is the concept of precaution, or the precautionary principle, which simply states that even if we are not totally sure of the cause and effect, if there is enough evidence to show a relationship, then we should act with caution when dealing with the issue. For example, a precautionary approach has been taken by many countries regarding climate change. Even if a direct cause and effect relationship has not been shown between increasing CO2 levels and climate change, enough evidence exists to work to reduce our CO2 production, just in case a cause and effect relationship is shown in the future. Precautionary principle continued. Based on the previous scenario, we can apply the four tenets of the precautionary principle to climate change. Do scientists suspect something bad is about to happen? Yes. Are there alternatives to waiting on some new technology to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere? Yes, we can reduce emissions now. Are climate change proponents working to prove the relationship between CO2 and climate change? Yes. Has the decision-making process been open and transparent? Yes. In this instant, the precautionary principle may be appropriate. Public awareness influences policy. Important to the precautionary principle and to development of policy is public awareness. How do we raise awareness? Proponents often use protests that bring media attention and more awareness. This is important because public involvement is important in the democratic process. How are policies made? How are policies developed? Environmental law involves the rules and decisions regarding the environment. Based on these two types of law are developed: statute law and case law. Statute law are formal laws passed by Congress. Case law is derived from court decisions in both criminal and civil courts. Case law guides the interpretation of law in the future by setting a precedent. Because policy is guided by the laws enacted by Congress, we need to discuss how the policy cycle works. The policy cycle is an 8-step process which begins with the identification of the problem. This step is very important because competing groups may or may not agree on the problem. Once the problem is identified, parties with an interest in the problem set agendas and develop proposals on how to solve the problem. As a side note, in environmental science, many problems do not have a specific right or wrong answer. These are called wicked problems. In that case, it may be very difficult to find an agreed upon solution or proposal. Regardless, once a problem is agreed upon, groups build support for the proposal. Support is often developed by lobbying of groups with an interest in the outcome. If enough support is gathered, Congress votes to enact the law, and the President must then sign the legislation, making it the law. Once a rule becomes the law, it must be implemented and enforced. Without this step, a law is worthless. After some time of implementation, the law should be evaluated to see if it has been effective. At this point, changes may be suggested to address any shortcomings in the law. If need be, the law can be tweaked to address any shortcomings. It is this step that allows laws to effectively address a problem. Lobbying influences government. Groups or individuals with an interest in pending legislation can often have influence through lobbying. Lobbying consists of visiting congressional offices and talking directly to representatives to persuade them to vote in one's favor. Sometimes average citizens lobby Congress. Not everyone can go to Washington to lobby their representatives, so many people join organizations that send professional lobbyists that carry their message. The NRA, AARP, Sierra Club, Audubon Society, and many other groups use this approach. Bills move slowly through Congress. Committee hearings and compromise. A bill succeeding in full committee is reported to the full House or Senate for a floor debate. Amendments may be proposed at each stage. The House and Senate generally have different versions of a bill, and these must be sent to a conference committee to iron out differences. Final steps in passing a statute. Next, the bill is passed on to the President, who may sign it or veto it. A 2/3 vote of House and Senate can override veto if necessary. If the President takes no action within 10 days of receiving a bill from Congress, it becomes a law without his signature. You can find out how your legislators voted on environmental issues by consulting the nonpartisan Thomas website, http://thomas.gov, maintained by Congress, or by checking the League of Conservation Voters website. Legislative riders. If you remember, step 4 of the policy cycle was to develop support. Often, sponsors of the bill may not have enough backing to get a bill passed. When this happens, they often agree to add amendments to the bill which authorize monies to be spent elsewhere. Those monies often benefit the constituents of the person the sponsor is trying to get to support the bill. This tactic can also be used by industry groups. This has become important in modern politics because few bills are now passed as clean bills with no riders. SLAPP suits can intimidate. Because the policy cycle requires participation in the political process, any actions that can reduce that participation can have impacts on the outcome of the cycle. One such tactic are the SLAPP lawsuits. These lawsuits are filed not so much to receive monetary compensation, but to harass and intimidate groups or people from participating in the process. The costs associated with defending themselves in court are often enough to stop participation. Regulatory agencies. As you recall, a law is only effective if it is enforced. Enforcement is through regulatory agencies. Several agencies are important in the environmental arena. These include the EPA, National Park Service, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and many others. Regulatory agencies continued. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, Department of Labor, Occupational Health and Safety Agency, OSHA. Major environmental laws. Through the policy cycle and legislative process, the U.S. has passed several major laws designed to benefit the environment. These include the National Environmental Policy Act that requires impact statements for any federal project. It is the basis for U.S. environmental law. Major environmental laws. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1970 to reduce air emissions and to improve air quality. The CAA sets limits for criterion pollutants. One of the most successful uses of the CAA was the requirement to eliminate lead in gasoline in the U.S. The removal of the lead resulting in drastic reductions in childhood lead poisoning. The Clean Air Act. Major environmental laws continued. The Clean Water Act, CWA, was enacted to protect our surface waters from contamination through point sources of pollution. A pipe running from a factory into a river would be a point source. However, the act was amended to include non-point sources, which are often the largest source of pollution. Major environmental laws continued. The Endangered Species Act, ESA, was originally passed to protect species deemed vulnerable or threatened by extinction. Support for the act came about as we realize the importance of diversity and system stability. Later authorizations of the ESA added habitat as a protected class. Because habitat destruction is a leading cause of extinction, habitat protection may be as important as the protection of the species. The last piece of environmental legislation passed was the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA. CERCLA established a legal liability for polluters. In conjunction with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, not only was liability established, but penalties could now be assessed to polluters. These fines are used to pay to clean up the worst populated areas. Because of that, CERCLA is often called the Superfund